Hello from snowy Colorado. I'm Peter Zeihan, and we're going to talk today about what's going on in another snowy location, Ukraine. Now, for those of you who have not had your heads stuck in the sand, you know that the Russians are making all kinds of threatening noises, and everyone in Europe is concerned that the Russians are about to use those 100,000 troops that they've got massed on the border to actually invade and conquer the country. The United States and the Brits have been leading a coalition of countries trying to dissuade the Russians from doing this, shipping weapons into the Ukrainian theater, and putting together a prepared package of financial sanctions that would prevent the Russians from participating in modern society. All in all, if it happens, it would be the strictest sort of sanctions that we've seen against any real country and really in modern history. And the Russians are not taking it lying down. They're saying if this does come to pass, that they will cut off all energy exports to Europe. Now that's just over 1/3 of the natural gas that the Europeans use, as well as somewhere around 30% of their oil. To that end, the Biden administration, working with a few others, has started to put together the pieces of a plan to ship natural gas from the United States and other major producers into into Europe in order to make up for the shortfalls. Sounds like a great plan, right? This should just solve the issue. The US is the world's largest natural gas producer. We get lots of waste stuff out of the shale fields. Perfect, right? Well, not really. Natural gas is a gas. It's difficult to store, so it's not like we've got a big pile of the stuff laying around somewhere. In addition, demand for natural gas tends to be relatively inelastic. So if you have like a 2% shortage, the prices can go up by like 50%. And that's certainly the case in Europe, where most of the natural gas is not used for chemical purposes, but to burn for electricity. And if you run out of electricity in the winter, well, that's a problem. So what's going on here? What's really going on? Well, there's a little bit of hope that this plan might work a little bit. Most natural gas is shipped via pipe. It's produced, it's put in the pipe, it's sent to the end consumer, end of the story. But when you ship it across oceans, you usually don't use pipes, you usually freeze it down into a liquid and put it on a special liquefied natural gas carrier vessel, which then sends it to the wider world. Because of that, oftentimes there are tanks of LNG either at the point where it's sent or the point where it is received. And that buffer can be played with a little bit. So there might be enough natural gas out there to get 1 or 2 billion cubic feet per day to the Europeans without too many problems. That's not going to cover 10% of what they need, but it's not insignificant. Second, we are in an era of rapid deglobalization. And we're nearing the point where weaker economic systems are going to have to try to attach themselves to stronger ones to survive once globalization breaks down completely. Now, the Europeans have never thought of themselves as one of those weaker systems, but when it comes to energy, they most certainly are. Roughly 90% of the energy needs of the European Union are imported. That percentage has gone up with Brexit. Well, the United States is the world's largest energy producer, and it makes sense that at some point, some parts of Europe are going to try to move in with the United States, so to speak. This could be the first piece of that. But the United States certainly does not have enough to supply everyone. So for this to work, Europe, as we understand it, has to stop functioning. Which means that a Russian invasion of Ukraine is really just the first step down a very, very long road to European dissolution. All right, that's it for me. Until the next war.
Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona. Today we have to talk about the summit between the strongmen of Russia and Korea. So Vladimir Putin on the Russian side and Kim Jong-un on the Korean side. They met in one of the Russian cosmodromes in the Far East, and the primary topic was whether or not the North Koreans can provide the Russians with military assistance, which, for anyone who has a sense of history, the irony here is practically bleeding out of the sky. Anyway, the issue, of course, is that the Russian war in Ukraine is not going to spec, and when you have a conscript-heavy force like the Russians do, you try to use standoff weapons that aren't particularly smart in large volumes, specifically artillery. If you exclude either China or the United States from the math, Russia has more artillery than the rest of the planet combined. And best guess is by the end of this year, they'll have gone through over 20 million artillery shells. Artillery shells don't age particularly well, and after they're more than like 10, and especially after 20 years old, the explosives start to crystallize a little bit, and that can make things decidedly lively when you try to, I don't know, move them, especially when you try to launch them. So the Russians have had a lot of accidents with the transport system, their logistical system, and then, of course, they've had a lot of barrels and the artillery just blow up from the inside. All of these are bad things if you're trying to launch a lot of artillery. So they need more shells, and they're turning to North Korea, which I believe has the world's 4th largest stock of artillery. The problem here, of course, is that North Korea's industrial plant isn't exactly great either, and a lot of the North Korean stuff is actually older than the Russian stuff. Gives you an idea of how desperate the Russians are for ammo. Now, the question, of course, is what do the North Koreans get in return? Because the Russians don't have anything from a trade point of view that's of use. You might be able to send a few tankers of crude oil, but the Russians honestly need that for hard currency earnings. So the question is if there's anything else that can be transferred. In terms of military technology, there really isn't. One of the things that the Indians have found out recently, that they've been developing missiles and planes with the Russians where the Indians provide a lot of the capital, and then the Russians provide the technical know-how. And what they've discovered is very few of those contracts are actually being honored by the Russian side because the Russians have lost the technical capacity to manufacture even moderate numbers of planes. So they're now starting to back out of all their contracts because they realize that the Russians have been lying to them the whole time. In addition, there's some talk of like maybe a nuclear-powered vessel or submarine, but it's taken the Russians 15 years to build their last nuclear-powered ship, which was an icebreaker. So the argument to be made here is whether or not the Russians even have the capacity to sustain their existing nuclear naval fleet, much less build new ships for themselves, much less have surplus to transfer to North Koreans. And honestly, it's looking pretty poor for that. That doesn't mean the Russians have nothing, and it doesn't mean that it's not a problem. It's just probably not going to be the things that most people are talking about. Look at where the meeting was, the Cosmodrome. This is a facility out in the Far East that the Russians built when they lost control of the Kazakhstan Cosmodrome at the end of the Cold War. And when it comes to launching satellites or intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Russians are still one of the few places in the world where that technology can theoretically be obtained, even if the Russians have lost the capacity to build a lot of new stuff themselves. So the primary global concern, primary regional concern for North Korea is missiles, long-range missiles, and that is something the Russians have in spades. So whether it's officially part of a program to launch a satellite into space, which, whatever, or more likely to deliver a payload to another hemisphere, that is something the Russians can and probably are willing to transfer to the North Koreans because the Russians are no longer party to any meaningful arms control treaties at all, which will generate no end of headache, not just for the South Koreans and the Japanese and the Chinese, who, newsflash, the North Koreans hate the Chinese, but also the United States. There's not a lot the United States can do about this because the North Koreans are not in a position where sanctions work at all. All you can do is punish the Russians indirectly and hope for the best. And that's not a great security strategy, but that is where we are. Yeah, that's all I got. Bye.